on what's going on with the banking situation, with access to finance, and also look at a few economic indicators which might give you an idea as to where this whole thing might be going. And the reason I'm doing this is because everyone seems very unsettled, and it's incredibly easy to get a very disproportionate view of what's going on, which then leads to bad decisions being made by people. And therefore, I want to just talk through some of this stuff, look at it from a macro level point of view, and then go from there. The very first thing is this idea of the property cycle. And I've talked about this numerous times. So I'm going to dig up a chart now. And it's, I'm just going to put the screen share on. Here we go. Little old me. And here is property cycles going back to 1845. And the fact is they do cycle. And when they follow a typical pattern where there's a crash and then a slow recovery, then you get some sort of correction event, and then you have a final push. And if we look at, say, the Northwest, this is the housing data for that area, and in real terms, the market declined by about 12 to 15%. But if you look at the data across the UK from 2003 to 22, I'll just adjust that actually. So I'll make that 2003 to 2014. There we go. Just makes the data a little more useful. And in fact, it's not changed, but that's okay because it helps us sort of get a sense of what's going on in relative terms. And we can see that these are nominal house prices, and it took about 18 months from peak of market to the very bottom of the market for prices to go down by £25,000 per average property. But it differs massively depending on the area. So, for example, if we look at a different region and we go, say, England as a whole, then we can see the charts will look a bit different. So average 194 and then drop to 159, so £40,000 decline, which so 194, so 159 divided by 194 equals a 19% decline. But it varies depending on the area you're in. So Northwest was a lesser decline than Southeast, for example, or areas within the Southeast. But the point is that overall, when you look at house price crashes, they're not as severe as people think. It's just that people get this idea from the news that everything's just collapsing. In reality, certain areas collapsed badly. These might have been very speculative areas in, say, Liverpool, for example, which was hit badly. But overall, what actually gets house prices is not the nominal crash, but it's the flatlining of the housing market for many years and then slowly marching inflation. So, but that's only half the story. There's another part to the whole story, which is inflation, and how that if you have fixed interest deals, that inflation is your friend because it erodes the value of the money that you have borrowed. And it's very likely within, say, 5 years that £100,000 in today's money, if you borrow £100,000 today, then say within 5 years, assuming current rates of inflation or less than that actually, but you assume a compounded level of inflation, you might find that in today's purchasing power, that money in 5 years' time might be worth £60,000. So £40,000 has just evaporated. There are a lot of concepts here, and I've done various videos on these things, so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but I just want to reiterate the anatomy of a property cycle. And so here, for example, is 1988 crash. And typically what happens is that people can sustain high mortgage repayments for a while, for 2 or 3 years, then there's a crash. That seems to be the cycle. And if we look at history, history tells us that firstly, history never repeats, but it certainly rhymes. And we have a period very similar to the 1940s where you have chronic inflation and still relatively low interest rates as compared to historic averages, which are around 4.5% if you average out interest rates for the whole century. Interest rates got very high in the 70s, but that's because there was very little government debt and very little private debt, relatively speaking. So therefore, banks could afford to push interest rates higher to curb high levels of inflation. But back in the Second World War, that wasn't the case. It was low interest rates because there was high volumes of government debt. And now we have reasonably high volumes of government debt. And every time interest rates go up, it means that government debt costs more to maintain. But on the other side of the coin, high inflation also affects government debt repayments because a lot of government debt is denominated in inflation tracking bonds. So high inflation equals high repayment costs for the government, and therefore the government has to find that money from somewhere, and that turns into higher taxation. So the only way out is you either tax higher, or they tax higher, or they get more productivity. And that's what the government are trying to go for at the moment. So, okay, we then had a big announcement. That's roughly how that fits together. And then we had a big announcement that the government was going to make a whole number of tax changes, and they were going to be paid through debt. So, in other words, it's a bit like saying that, for example, you're going to set up a new business, you're going to load up your credit card to the max and just give it a go. But a lot of businesses fail, and therefore that would be an unwise decision if you did not manage risk properly. And I think the markets have said to the government, this seems ill thought out and we don't like it. And then, so then we go back to some more indicators. And so what happens is, from a mortgage point of view, because that's what we're interested in, we need to look at what impacts the cost of money for the banks, and or impacts interest costs for the banks. And generally, you would say that it's the price of money that banks borrow at. So banks need to borrow money to lend out money. So they buy money, basically. And one of the key indicators is the interbank, the LIBOR rate. So we're going to look at that in a minute. And then beyond that, there are risk variables that banks use, like your loan to value, your creditworthiness, and all that stuff. And then, of course, there's the base interest rate. And then in this whole mix of stuff, you end up with an interest rate that is charged for you, or charged to you, should I say. So, for example, I've just been looking at this, and if we say 2-year fixed, you can see that they're suggesting 5.67. Now, last time I checked on this was maybe a month ago, and it was about 3.5%. So banks believe there's an awful lot more risk right now, and therefore they've raised the cost of their borrowing to you by 2% or thereabouts. They're effectively doing what the government want to do, which is to soak up extra money in the system to kill off inflation. And so it's called demand destruction. And we can see it's 5.7. But what's interesting is that if you go to a 5-year fixed, the rates are very similar. So 5.19 for 5-year, and if we go to that, 5.67. Go for a 10-year fixed, and let's see what we got. Well, then, okay, they're pessimistic. They're not hardly anyone's offering a 10-year fix for a buy-to-let mortgage. And the reason is because they have no idea which way the market's going to go, and I could understand that. But 3 months ago, you could get a 10-year fixed pretty easily. So in other words, the rate at which money is offered is based on perceived risk. And then we have another question, which is, what about the cost of money? And let's have a look at that. So this is the LIBOR rate, and I'm going to go to a 1-year graph. And we can see that the rate has been gradually creeping up. There was a big announcement. It all spiked up, and now it's settled down. And my guess is that it'll keep creeping up in line with interest rate increases. So here we have, for example, I'll give you a 5-year. There you go. So we can see interest rates are flying up from 2000 and late 21. And if we go back to the LIBOR rate, we can see that the price of money is creeping up as well. It's not like the LIBOR rate has gone up to 7% or something. And in fact, if we look at the long-term story with LIBOR, we can see that at one stage it was 15% back in 88. And then prior to the crash in 2008, it was about 5.5%, 6%, and it's kind of creeping up that way. The main difference, though, is that house prices had priced in cost of money at this level, and now what's really difficult for everyone is that house prices have been priced in for cost of money at this low level, and therefore we have this huge readjustment issue going on. And that's going to make it very tough for a lot of people. But if you're an investor, you're entering the market, you got choices, because you can go for properties which have higher yields. And so that's that. But then there's a little bit more to this whole story. So the kind of feedback I've had from clients and so on is they're asking, well, why don't I just renegotiate the price, since the market's obviously crashing like crazy? And in my direct experience with what's going on, the market isn't crashing like crazy. The market has been shocked because of this nonsense that's occurred recently, and banks are offering very bad deals right now. But the reason is because they just want to protect their position. They can change interest costs on products really easily. And so they do. And here we are. And we've got this going on. Now, my guess is that just like everyone that has a shock, because a lot of this is human stuff, it's people making decisions, I suspect in a few weeks' time, when people see that the government is being pragmatic and listening, and there's a particular office called the Office for Fiscal Responsibility, I think, or there's a government department who are going to analyze the whole budget plan, and they'll give a report on this, and they'll say this is what we think. And so the likely outcome is that that the government will have to backpedal on a whole number of budgetary initiatives. The markets will respond and say, well, at least you listened, thank you, and then confidence will return. But just as with any shock, it takes a little while for that to happen. But we can see that they are actually just, let's say they're considering things. And here we have some more stuff here. So basically what commentators are saying is they made a huge mistake. Markets responded. They're now backtracking. They've lost a lot of political currency. Okay, whatever. But what's most important for you as an investor is that markets will return. Now, I also have this. So I was sent this by my favorite, one of my favorite mortgage brokers, and hopefully I'm going to do a call with him and record this. But anyway, he's just saying that Hampshire Trust Bank have backed off. They're not accepting any new business. I don't know exactly what's going on with Octopus Real Estate, but I'd also know that Gatehouse have backed off and backed out of the market. And I think what they're all doing, what certainly Gatehouse have been doing, and I suppose Hampshire Trust have been doing, is to just pause, catch up with the backlog of work, get everything back in order again, and then re-enter the market with whatever interest rate they feel is appropriate considering the given risk at that time in the future. So unless you've got an existing mortgage offer in place, then there aren't many borrowing choices right now. And the choices, as far as I can see, based on just my back and forth with people in the market, are if you've got cash, you're king, obviously. But if you're waiting because you believe the market's going to crash, I don't really have confidence in that. And the reason I believe that, and back to screen share again, is because if we look at housing supply, essentially there is very little supply. So there is some private build going on, but generally speaking, when you look at the, I'm just looking for a particular chart. Right, so this is a chart I don't really understand that well, but essentially what this article is saying is that house prices are rising as a consequence of increased demand. And what I see on a day-to-day basis is that and private renting is going up, even though private renting is increasing, a lot of landlords are getting out. So there's actually much less supply of rental properties than there used to be versus, say, 2017. And that's because of tax changes. So yes, the supply of rental property is going up, but there is huge rental demand. And we see this with our own data. So the upshot is, on a granular day-to-day basis, I know that there's a lot of demand. And what's happening is that you have a range of properties from junk or properties that are just not competitive to good property. Compromised properties, you will see a discount on those prices for sure. But then do you want to own a compromised property? So that might be a property that backs onto a railway or a motorway, or is underneath electricity pylons, or is in an area with high flood risk, or any of those kind of circumstances. And when times are good again, those are going to be the properties that will be hard to sell. So for any sensible investor, what you do is you buy good property that doesn't have any compromises, that can be resold easily. And when times are good, they are the properties that go up in value substantially versus the bad properties in bad areas, in bad locations. So on a day-to-day, what I'm finding is that deals are collapsing. I would say maybe 10% of deals out there, based on just feeling what's going on, are under stress because of mortgage issues. But I also know that good properties, which are uncompromised, are still selling really quickly because there's enough buyers out there, especially in the buy-to-let segment, which is the cheap end of the market. There are lots of cash buyers out there. There are lots of foreign nationals buying. Any country that has their currency pegged to the dollar is in a good position, obviously, at the moment. And people know that bad times will pass. And if you look objectively at the marketplace, you'll see that whilst there will be a decline in values in a crash on average, it's only an average. And I see this all the time when I'm looking at my detailed data, where I look at one area over another. In huge areas in Manchester, for example, the actual property decline was 5-6%. It was nominal on median house prices. So the main thing I'm saying is that the mortgage market will come back. Yes, interest rates are likely to be a bit higher. Good properties are still in demand. If you go for higher yield, that's a sensible thing to do. But make sure that you go for a good property that isn't compromised, which then means there will be competition on them. And then everything will hold together for you. Your choice, by the way, is to sit on cash. But then if you do that, your money is going to get devalued because of inflation. So the overall equation makes sense to borrow when you can, lock the price in, and then as long as inflation is higher than the cost of your interest costs, then in effect you're in a positive arbitrage situation. In other words, the value of the money that you've got on loan is going down in real terms for you. So I've done a big video explaining all these concepts. In summary, I think we're going through a blip, and this is confirmed by one of my favorite mortgage advisors, a guy called David Eva, who really knows his stuff. The LIBOR market shows this. I.e. the money markets show this. We are likely to be in for more interest rate hikes, but I don't know how aggressive they will be. Banks have kind of done it for the Bank of England. So Bank of England raises base interest rates to soak up surplus money in the ecosystem, but banks have raised their interest rates in response to fear of risk. And that's in effect an interest rate hike, for instance. So there are an awful lot of dynamics going on here. And for those people who either want to renegotiate, I think the market's still strong for good houses. It's not as strong as it was 4 months ago, but it's still reasonably strong. It's gone from completely insane to still fairly solid. For weaker properties, yeah, of course you can pick up a deal, but then people aren't that distressed yet. And history tells us that it takes at least 18 months for the market to settle down at a new level prior to a shock. So in reality, do you want to wait 18 months and risk, say, a 10% or even more erosion of the value of your capital? Or what do you want to do? So there are lots of conundrums. In my case, I think if I see a good property, I would take it. If I've got a good property in play going through conveyancing, I wouldn't try and chip the price down unless there was a legitimate reason, because there will be other buyers for that property. And I think interest rates will settle down in a few weeks, and we then go from there. Anyway, I hope that's some help. It's a difficult time. And I always think just look at the big picture and then kind of work your way down to the little picture, and that gives you context for where we are. There it is. All right, thanks.